Ashley Floor, and you know what I'm talking about here on my channel right now.
Hi besties, welcome back to my channel, welcome back to Coravanta, and today we need to talk about something that somehow keeps getting brushed past every time this Blake Lively situation comes up, because everyone wants to argue about vibes, or feelings, or who said what in interviews, but very few people want to slow down and look at what actually happened on that set, who made the decisions, and who paid the price for those decisions. Because buried inside all of this noise is a very real fact that keeps getting minimized, and that fact is this: Blake Lively had people fired, specifically a veteran assistant director named Julie Bloom, and the story of why Julie Bloom was fired keeps changing depending on who is telling it, when they are telling it, and who they are telling it to, which is usually a big red flag when you're trying to figure out what really went down. At first, Blake denied that she fired anyone at all, which is important because that tells you immediately that this was not something she wanted publicly attached to her name, and that denial didn't last very long, because text messages surfaced showing that a story was about to leak about the firing of the first AD, and there were internal conversations about trying to keep that story from being published, including Ryan Reynolds wanting the team to do damage control, except they couldn't, because the problem was that the story was true. Once that truth became unavoidable, the explanation shifted, and suddenly the firing wasn't about power or control or scheduling failures tied to Blake herself. It was about Julie Bloom allegedly creating unsafe environments, allegedly making women uncomfortable, allegedly causing chaos on set, except when you start examining those claims closely, they don't line up very well with Julie Bloom's actual career or the testimony that came later. Julie Bloom was not some inexperienced hire who wandered onto a film set unprepared. This is someone who had been working in the industry for over 30 years, someone who had served as both a second assistant director and a first assistant director on major films and television productions, someone who worked on projects like Annie, The Wolf of Wall Street, Sleeping with the Enemy, and later on high-profile series like Perry Mason, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and Sweet Bitter. She worked on films like Late Night, After the Wedding, Life Itself, Rough Night, and as recently as 2023, Ezra. Experience was not her issue, no matter how many times that word got repeated later as a justification, but if you listen to how Alex Sachs framed the situation, or how Blake framed it later, you would come away thinking that Julie Bloom was somehow unqualified, overwhelmed, or incapable of running a set, which is interesting, because those claims only really started surfacing after Blake decided she wanted her gone. And this is where things start to matter, because this firing didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a very specific moment in the production, during a period where schedules were falling apart, budgets were ballooning, wardrobe was becoming a distraction, and filming locations were exposed to the public, resulting in leaks and online criticism. Blake's own testimony is key here, because she explains that she felt she needed to speak to Angie Jannetty to express her concerns, and according to Blake, this conversation centered on scheduling problems, not making days, and the perception that she was being blamed for delays. She claims that there was a discussion about the crew coming in early so she could attend a concert, something she says she didn't request, but felt was being framed as if she did. According to her, she agreed to come in early because she was there to work, not because she wanted accommodations, but she suspected that the narrative being passed along was that the early call times were her request so she could leave for a concert, and she didn't like that the concert in question matters, because the only concert that ever comes up in this timeline is Taylor Swift's concert on May 13th. Which just happens to fall during a period when Blake claimed her child was sick, preventing her from traveling to Las Vegas for scheduled filming on May 8th. The production was supposed to be in Vegas for a full week, but that entire week was lost, and yet Blake was able to travel to Philadelphia on May 12th and 13th to attend a concert. That inconsistency is not minor, because losing an entire week of shooting time has serious budget implications, and someone always ends up being blamed for that loss. During this same period, the set was filming in public locations, fans were watching, photos were leaking, and Blake's wardrobe became a major talking point online. Instead of viewing this as an inevitable result of filming on public streets, the blame began shifting toward Julie Bloom, as if the assistant director was responsible for fans showing up, filming monitors, and posting clips online. And yet, those same wardrobe issues were also being flagged internally by Sony, not just by Justin Baldoni, which becomes very important later when Angie Jannetty testified about this period. Her recollection of the conversation with Blake paints a different picture than Blake's version. Angie recalls that they were talking constantly about the script, about scheduling, about wardrobe, and that Blake was increasingly critical of the first AD. When asked whether Blake raised specific incidents of misconduct by Justin, Angie said no, that the complaints were more about Justin being sensitive, about him taking criticism personally, about Blake feeling like she had to emotionally manage him before they could continue working. That is very different from claiming a hostile or unsafe environment, and it matters because it shapes how serious the alleged concerns really were at that time. Most telling of all is Angie's answer when asked directly whether Blake asked her to do anything about these issues. Her response was clear: Blake asked for help getting rid of the first AD. That was the request. Not filing an HR complaint, not escalating safety concerns, not initiating a formal investigation, but removing Julie Bloom. And when asked whether Blake used the word HR, Angie said she did not remember Blake using that term at all. This is where the narrative starts to crack, because if the primary concern was safety or misconduct, the natural step would be documentation, HR involvement, or formal complaints. Instead, the focus was on replacing the assistant director, and that replacement conveniently aligned with Alex Sachs' desire to bring in someone she preferred working with, someone who would give her more control over the production. Alex herself admitted that she was ready to bring in a new AD team, and she expressed dissatisfaction with how the set was being run, but she also acknowledged that she wasn't sure whether the issues stemmed from the AD, from planning, from the director of photography, or from general production delays. There was an issue, yes, but its source was not clearly defined. What becomes harder to ignore is that lateness was a recurring problem, and from Angie's perspective, Blake was often late to set, late to rehearsals, late to scenes, and instead of owning that lateness, the blame was being placed on the assistant director for call times, scheduling, and communication. In other words, the person whose job it is to enforce the schedule became the scapegoat for the person who was not following it. And this is not an uncommon dynamic on film sets, because first ads are often the enforcers, the ones who push actors to move faster, to stay on schedule, to get through scenes efficiently, which can naturally create friction with performers who want more time, more flexibility, or more control. By the time Julie Bloom was fired, the groundwork had already been laid to justify it, but what's interesting is what happened afterward, because the problems didn't stop. The days were still long. The schedule was still tight. The budget was still under pressure. And yet, suddenly, those same issues were reframed not as failures, but as evidence of Blake's leadership, dedication, and hands-on involvement. In her letter to the Producers Guild, Blake openly took responsibility for firing Julie Bloom, claiming she had the experience to see that the days were not boarded correctly, that the schedule was flawed from the start, and that Julie's experience was not appropriate for the film, a claim that directly contradicts Julie's extensive resume. Blake also positioned herself as deeply involved in nearly every aspect of production, from scheduling to security to wardrobe to COVID protocols to shot. Listing to HR concerns, effectively portraying herself as a de facto producer. And yet, even she admits that after Julie was replaced, the production was still struggling to make its days, which raises a simple but uncomfortable question: if the problems didn't improve, then what exactly was the firing meant to solve? And that's where we need to pause, because this is the turning point. This is where the story stops being about whether Julie Bloom was a good or bad assistant director, and starts being about power, control, and narrative management. We're going to break down what changed after Julie was gone, why the blame shifted, how Sony's wardrobe concerns factor into all of this, and why these same production issues are now being repackaged as part of a legal strategy. By the time the first AD was gone and a replacement was quietly slid into position, the narrative around the set had already been carefully reshaped, and that reshaping matters more than the firing itself, because it reveals how power actually moved on this production and why so many of the later claims fall apart when you line the timelines up properly. Once Julie Bloom was removed, the delays did not magically disappear, the budget did not suddenly snap back into shape, and the days did not start running smoothly, which should have been the outcome if the problem truly was a weak or inexperienced first AD. Instead, the same issues kept repeating, only now they were easier to bury because the scapegoat had already been sacrificed and the internal hierarchy had shifted in a way that favored Blake and Alex rather than Justin. This is where the story stops being about whether Julie was good at her job and starts being about how control was consolidated on set and later reframed in legal filings and public-facing statements. When Blake later wrote to the PGA and openly took credit for firing Julie, she framed it as an act of professional responsibility, something she had the experience and foresight to recognize early. Yet when the news risked becoming public in a way that might reinforce her reputation for being difficult or controlling, the instinct was to shut it down, soften it, or redirect blame. That contradiction alone tells you that the issue was never just operational efficiency, it was image management, both in real time on set and retroactively once the production became a legal and PR battlefield. What's striking when you read Angie Janetti's testimony alongside Alex Sachs' comments is how consistently the blame for lateness and schedule breakdowns gets rerouted away from Blake's actual arrival times and decisions and onto abstract concepts like confusion, lack of structure, or the way things were explained. Those are convenient phrases because they sound serious while remaining vague enough to avoid accountability. If Blake is late, the problem becomes the call time. If rehearsal takes too long, the problem becomes scheduling. If footage leaks from a public street shoot, the problem becomes security and badges rather than the reality that filming in public spaces invites attention by default. Each of these reframes turns a concrete, observable issue into a systemic failure that can be pinned on someone else, and the first AD is the easiest target because their job is literally to manage time, people, and logistics. Actors have been using ads as shields for decades. It's an old industry trick, and it works because most outsiders don't understand how much influence a star actually wields compared to someone whose job is to enforce discipline. Once Chris replaced Julie, the production still struggled to make its days, something Blake herself admitted without realizing how damaging that admission actually was. If the delays continued under a new AD whom she liked and trusted, then the original justification for firing Julie collapses. The difference was not performance, the difference was alignment. Chris was part of a team that Alex felt comfortable with, a team that did not threaten her sense of authority or challenge her approach, and that alone made the working relationship feel smoother even if the underlying problems persisted. Comfort can be mistaken for competence when you're invested in a particular outcome, and that confusion shows up repeatedly in the way Blake describes her own role. She casts herself as the fixer, the organizer, the person holding everything together, yet the facts she provides often undermine that image because they reveal how deeply she was involved in decisions that contributed to the very chaos she later complained about. The wardrobe issue is a perfect example of this pattern because it demonstrates how personal insecurity, creative control, and studio-level concerns collided in a way that had nothing to do with Justin's alleged behavior and everything to do with Blake's self-image and authority. Sony's internal messages make it clear that the costumes were distracting from the story, not enhancing it, and that concern came from executives who had no personal stake in on-set power dynamics. When Sanford Penich talks about outfits pulling viewers out of scenes, he's not making a moral judgment or siding with one person over another, he's talking about audience perception and commercial viability. That distinction matters because it strips away the emotional framing Blake later used and replaces it with a straightforward business concern. Justin became the messenger for that concern, and as often happens, the messenger absorbed the resentment even though the message did not originate with him. Instead of addressing the studio's feedback directly, Blake internalized it as a personal attack, which then fed into a broader narrative of being undermined, controlled, or mistreated, even as she was actively exercising control over other aspects of the production. This is where the lawsuit narrative begins to feel less like a genuine reckoning and more like a strategic inversion. The same actions Blake used as proof of her authority and competence in her PGA letter are later repurposed as evidence that she was marginalized or forced to step in because no one else was doing their job. You can't have it both ways without eventually exposing the contradiction. Either she had the power to fire a first AD, influence hiring decisions, reshape schedules, and intervene in creative and logistical matters, or she was a victim of an out-of-control set with no recourse. The record shows she had power, and not just symbolic power, but practical, outcome-determining power that most actors do not have. That power explains why her complaints carried weight, why Julie was removed, and why Alex's preferences ultimately shaped the team going forward. The way Justin is positioned in all of this is also revealing because his testimony about the AD issue is almost strikingly minimal. He describes being told that Blake wanted to talk to Angie about firing the first AD because she didn't like how the set was running, and that's essentially it. There's no elaborate accusation, no emotional retelling, just a factual acknowledgement of what he was informed about. That restraint contrasts sharply with the expansive narratives later built around his supposed behavior, and it raises an uncomfortable question: if the environment truly was as unsafe and untenable as Blake later suggested, why didn't those concerns appear clearly and consistently in contemporaneous accounts? Why do they seem to grow in severity only after control battles, schedule issues, and budget overruns had already created tension? When you zoom out and look at the sequence as a whole, a pattern emerges that's hard to ignore. Problems arise that are either caused or exacerbated by Blake's decisions or circumstances, such as lateness, absences, wardrobe choices, and schedule disruptions. Those problems create pressure from the studio and the production team. Instead of absorbing that pressure, Blake redirects it toward individuals who can be removed or reframed as the source of dysfunction. Once those individuals are gone, the problems persist, but the narrative has shifted enough that blame can now be reassigned elsewhere, often toward Justin, who by that point has less control over the team around him. This is not a chaotic accident, it's a classic example of how influence is used to manage perception while preserving one's own standing.